I'm being joined at this moment by Mr. N.K. Singh, Dr. N.K. Singh, former chairperson of the Finance Commission, a parliamentarian who had the privilege of working very closely with Dr. Manmohan Singh. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh, for joining us at this moment. As the nation mourns the passing away of one of its greatest sons, I was just reading, and he worked very closely with you at IEG where he was the president. Handing over the reins to you, he said, I want to, in fact, recommend my trusted friend and aide, N.K. Singh. How do you remember him today?
I remember him in multiple ways. I remember him, most important, as a kind, gentle, compassionate mentor. From the very first day when I met him in 1971, much before he had joined the Indian government. I remember him from that time. He was working at the NDTV at that time. And then he came to the Ministry of Commerce as economic advisor in the Ministry of Commerce. He came at a time when India was in the throes of much greater regulation of imports and exports. He recognized that this was also a phase of Indian economic history, and that he gave very sagacious advice in the Ministry of Commerce. Thereafter, he went as chief economic advisor to the Ministry of Finance in 1972. Our paths would repeatedly cross, but most important, our paths crossed once again, and he became the finance minister, and I was looking after the negotiations with the IMF and the World Bank. At that time, I remember that when I went to call on him, he said that he would wish to reshape India's economic landscape, India's economic architecture. He would do away with the shackles of the past, which had prevented the nation from realizing its economic potential. He was alluding to the far-reaching budget of 91, which he was to unravel thereafter, with changes in trade policy, with changes in exchange rate, with important structural economic reforms, and doing away with the debilitating economic regulations which we had. I then continued our relationship in Parliament, when I was a member of Parliament, when he was a Prime Minister. At that time, I remember of how short his intervention used to be. Sometimes people misunderstood him, that he did not speak adequately and often enough in Parliament. But whenever he spoke and chose to speak, across the ideological divide, they heard him with rapt attention because they realized the sagacity and the wisdom. This relationship continued till the very end, when he was generous enough to suggest that I succeed him as the president of the Institute of Economic Growth, which he was before me, which I continued to have. I remember him for his kindness, for his generosity, for being not only trusted friend, as you said, but someone who was a mentor to me in the decades which I had the privilege to serve in public office. That's how I remember him. I remember him a man driven with compassion, wisdom, empathy for the poor, and seeking to improve India's economic growth trajectory.
Dr. Singh, let me ask you this. Like you said, that sometimes he was misunderstood. People used to call him names because he was very soft-spoken, did not speak as much. As the Prime Minister, his mark has just not been on Indian economy, but also on our foreign affairs. Everybody remembers the India Civil Nuclear Deal, Manrega. So many aspects of India has been, in fact, touched by Dr. Manmohan Singh and his leadership. I remember him very famously saying that contemporary media and his opponents may not be, but the history will be kinder to him. As an ultimate outsider who came into the Indian political spectrum, went to the top, how do you, judge that, see him, in terms of how history is going to remember him?
Well, he never rubbed his office or his wisdom on your face. He was a humble man, a reticent man, and therefore an often misunderstood man. So I must say that you must see two parts to it. As finance minister, he faced immediate India's balance of payments crisis and how to prevent India's fair reputation of not defaulting on debt. And he's seeking and receiving the full support of Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, for instance, in the devaluation of the rupee, for which there were two elements to it. And notwithstanding the reservations of the then Prime Minister persuading him to carry this forward for India's long-term economic growth, that was to deal with economic crisis. And that was when the fullest support of the Prime Minister. When he became the Prime Minister himself, his interest in India's continued economic growth remained as fervent as ever before. But with one big difference. There was no crisis. There was also the issues of whether he would receive the full support of ideological divide, full support in his own party in undertaking many audacious reforms which were annual. So there were two different phases of Dr. Manmohan. Phase of the crisis, phase of the consolidation. But throughout all this, with a voice of sanity, of sagacity, of wisdom, providing mentorship to many in India and many abroad, whose appeal cut across ideological divides. And therefore, he was right. Today, we are talking about his legacy when he said, history will be kinder to me, in the words which are being spoken today. Media, multiple channels, is part of history, which he had foreseen, that history would be kinder to me.
Dr. Singh, thank you so much for being with us here on NDTV.